Hello, good evening, and welcome to our Providence Social Hour, which has been renamed a mixer, which I just learned this evening is a euphemism for a cocaine party at William and Mary. Did I understand that correctly? So we may reconsider the renaming and go back to Social Hours, but we're very glad that you're with us for a talk by Pollock, who is chair of the board of the Winston Churchill Library Society, and involved with their excellent library over at George Washington University, which you need to visit because they have excellent events. And the Winston Churchill Society's annual conference will be there, or here in town next week. I met Lee there just a few weeks ago when they were hosting a talk by the author of the new book on appeasement. And that was an incredible talk. And Lee mentioned his own expertise on the religion of Winston Churchill, which of course is in sync with our interest and themes here at IRD and at Providence, and is a very sometimes controversial or unsettled topic on which the final conclusive book is yet to be written. Maybe you need to write that book.
There you go.
So Lee, we're grateful you can be with us and take as much time as you would like to talk. It will be, of course, time for questions and comments afterwards.
Wonderful, thank you. If I don't want to use the mic, are you okay with that?
It helps for the video to catch on.
It helps, but probably not absolutely necessary.
Okay, then I will speak in a full voice and so forth. Well, Mark, thank you for that nice introduction. It's a pleasure to be here. It's my first time in your office, and I look forward to collaborating on other programs in future. As I think all of you know, Winston Churchill is in the news a great deal, and there's so much written about his life. What I'd like to do this evening is talk about a lesser known, but I think still very interesting aspect of his remarkable life, which is the role that religion and his own unique sense of personal destiny played in his remarkable career. I'd like to start these talks with a couple of stories, so I'll give you two. The first is May 10th, 1940. That evening, Winston Churchill returned from Buckingham Palace, having received the commission of King George VI to form a new government as Prime Minister and lead Britain during the Second World War. 2 days before that, an intense debate had boiled over in the House of Commons, leading to the resignation of the government of Neville Chamberlain, whose policy of appeasement had come to its unfortunate end. The very morning that Churchill took office, the German army poured into Belgium, Holland, and France, advancing with astonishing speed and success. The phony war, which had begun in September 1939, was over, and Adolf Hitler's Blitzkrieg was about to change history. As Churchill's car returned from Buckingham Palace, it was unusually quiet. His bodyguard, Inspector Walter Thompson, attempted to break the silence by congratulating his boss on his new appointment, but said the following: "Sir, I hope it is not too late." Churchill paused for a moment and very somberly replied, "I hope it is not too late as well. We can only do our best." But a few hours later, Churchill's mood had lightened considerably. He later wrote in his war memoirs, "As I went to bed around 3 a.m., I was conscious of a profound sense of relief. I felt as if I were walking with destiny, and that all my past life had been but a preparation for this hour and this trial. I was sure I would not fail." I can tell you that in Winston Churchill's walk with destiny lay the fate of Britain, of freedom, and of Western civilization itself. But that singular moment was just one example of Winston Churchill's belief in his future. When he was a young army officer a half-century before, stationed in India, he wrote his mother the following in a letter: "I have faith in my star. I am intended to do something in this world." 2 months later, after a dangerous skirmish on the northwest frontier in India, Churchill expressed no surprise at his survival, saying, perhaps not entirely in jest, "I am so conceited, I do not believe the gods would create so potent a being as myself for a prosaic ending." And most dramatically, when Winston Churchill was a 16-year-old at the Harrow School, he made the following comments to one of his fellow pupils. Churchill said, "I can see vast changes, great upheavals, terrible struggles, wars as one cannot imagine." He told his friend, "I see further ahead than you do. In the future, London will be in great danger, and in the high position I shall occupy, it will fall to me to save the capital and the empire." How many 16-year-olds do you know, then or now, who would have such faith in himself? It was quite remarkable. We often hear the saying that people absorb religion early in their life. So let's begin with Churchill's formative years. He was born, of course, at Blenheim Palace, the grandson of the great Duke of Marlborough. His earlier ancestor was the first Churchill who defeated the forces of Louis XIV in Europe. Churchill's own father, Lord Randolph Churchill, was an up-and-coming young politician elected to Parliament in 1874, the same year his son was born. The Churchill family stood at the heart of a small aristocratic elite that ruled Britain and its global empire, the greatest since the days of Rome. They were, of course, members of the Church of England, and Winston was duly baptized just after Christmas. The Anglican Church was wealthy and influential, and it was led by the Queen herself, Victoria, then in the 4th decade of her very long reign. While Catholicism and dissenting Protestant denominations had their place in the country, the dominance of the Church of England in England's national life was very clear. Winston Churchill's mother, Jenny Jerome, was American, born in Brooklyn, the daughter of a wealthy financier named Leonard Jerome. He came from good Protestant stock, descended from a French Huguenot immigrant family of the early 18th century. Neither Jenny nor Lord Randolph were what we would call today hands-on parents. They were preoccupied by their hectic political, and in her case, social lives, and like many aristocratic Victorians, they were absent and distant, sadly removed from their young child's daily life. Churchill's relationship with both his parents was troubled and conflicted, although he eventually became close to his mother, whose support was important to his early political career. He later said of her, quote, "She shone for me like the evening star," but added, "I loved her dearly, but from a distance." And as to his father, Lord Randolph, the historical record is complete with harsh letters from father to son, filled with expressions of disappointment and recrimination. They're painful to read today, even 150 years later. With Churchill's parents so often absent, his upbringing fell heavily to a beloved family retainer, his nanny, a woman named Elizabeth Everest. She showed him the affection and love that his parents lacked. Mrs. Everest also attempted to imbue young Winston with her low church principles, and in particular, her disdain for Catholicism. As it turned out, she had a particular dislike for the Pope on the somewhat dubious grounds that he was responsible for the Fenian troubles in Ireland. And while Churchill's views eventually changed, he held anti-Catholic opinions into his 20s. He complained to his brother in a letter in 1898 about what he called the damnable errors and wicked notions of the Catholic Church. Churchill's exposure to more formal religion came at St. George's School, a fashionable school near Ascot that he attended. There he was subject to 2 ordeals, flogging for his repeated impertinence and forced attendance at what Churchill called, quote, frequent religious services of a high church character. It appeared he found neither experience enjoyable. In 1888, at age 14, Churchill was sent to Harrow, then as now one of Britain's elite schools. At Harrow, religious observance was emphasized, and he attended 3 services every Sunday morning, along with morning and evening prayers every day of the week. He later remarked of this experience with his usual wit, "I accumulated in those years so fine a surplus in the bank of observance that I have been drawing confidently on it ever since. Weddings, christenings, and funerals have brought in a steady annual income, and I have never made inquiries about the state of my account. It might even well be, had I done so, that I should have found a surplus." Winston Churchill was thought by his father to be unsuited for the 2 great universities of Victorian England, Oxford and Cambridge. He actually briefly flirted with the idea of becoming a clergyman, one of the few occupations, along with the law, the military, and politics, that was considered suitable for the sons of the aristocracy. But on his 3rd attempt, Churchill was admitted to the Royal Military Academy at Sandhurst and began a military career. At Sandhurst, he focused primarily on military, not intellectual subjects, and after graduation was stationed with the 4th Hussars in Bangalore, India. The life of a young officer in the far-off Raj included leisurely early morning drills, followed by lunch and a lengthy afternoon break. Most of his fellow officers spent that time playing polo, drinking, or sleeping through the hot Indian sun. But Winston Churchill was far too restless and ambitious for that. He was determined to make up for his lack of a formal university education and enlisted his mother in that effort, sending her names of books he wished to be sent. For 4 or 5 hours a day, he pored over the great philosophers of his and earlier times: Gibbon, Macaulay, and Plato, Aristotle, Schopenhauer, Malthus, and Darwin. And in the course of that reading, he began to ponder religion. 3 authors in particular diminished Churchill's belief in conventional Christianity and, more dramatically, in the divinity of Christ itself. Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire and William Lecky's The Rise of Rationalism established in his mind what he later called, quote, a predominantly secular view of life. But it was a book by a man named William Winwood Reade entitled The Martyrdom of Man that convinced Churchill that Jesus was an inspired prophet, but not the Son of God. Reade, who's little remembered today, was born in 1838 and died just 6 months after Churchill's birth in 1874. He was a Victorian explorer, novelist, and war correspondent whose 2-volume book went into 8 editions after it was first published in 1872. Reade employed quasi-Darwinian terms to explain the rise and fall of empires from the Persians to the Romans. While Reade was not strictly an atheist, he was scathing about all forms of organized religion, which he dismissed as worthless superstition. Although Reade is little remembered today, his work influenced Arthur Conan Doyle, who mentions it in one Sherlock Holmes story, as well as writers like H.G. Wells and George Orwell. Reade likened Jesus to, quote, the noble prophets of the ancient period. He preached the religion of the heart. He offered consolation to the poor. But, Reade added in his opinion, Christ was, quote, the subject of a remarkable hallucination. He believed he was the Messiah. In his own charming memoir, My Early Days, written in 1930, Churchill recounted many evenings in India spent in discussion with his fellow officers about God and religion. Churchill wrote about those times, we used to argue whether we should live again in another world and whether some high intelligence was looking after this world. There was general agreement among us, if you tried your best to live an honorable life and were not unkind to the weak and the poor, it did not matter what you believed or disbelieved. That is what we would call today, quote, the religion of healthy-mindedness. There was a great clamor of religions in India in Churchill's time: Hindu, Muslim, Catholic, Protestant, and many charlatans. The subcontinent was filled with holy men, seers, mystics, and prophets. But Churchill's time in India generated in him and his fellow officers a belief that living an ethical life was what really mattered. So by the time Winston Churchill was in his mid-20s, his belief in conventional Christianity had been lost. In another passage in his book, My Early Life, he noted the challenge of rationalizing faith. He said, "If I had been at a university, my difficulties in this would have been resolved by eminent professors who would have shown me convincing books of the opposite view. As it was, I passed through a violent and aggressive anti-religious phase." Winston Churchill had not become an atheist, but he was at least now a skeptical rationalist. In 1898, he wrote to his mother saying, "I expect annihilation at death. I am a materialist to my fingertips." Another letter 6 months later added, "I do not accept the Christian or any other forms of religious belief." But while Churchill himself had little interest in the practice of religion, he was wary of a wholesale attack on it or rejection of it, especially in Christianity. Even though, to Churchill's mind, Reed had shown the falseness of Christian dogma, Churchill mused that it might not have been wise for him to do so. Churchill noted that there might be a time when, quote, Christianity will be put aside as a crutch which is no longer needed. And then he continued, "Till then, anyone who deprives us of our illusions is a wicked man." The British historian Paul Addison has summed up Churchill's beliefs at this time in the following way. For orthodox religion, Winston Churchill substituted a secular belief in historical progress with a strong emphasis on the civilizing mission of the British Empire. This was accompanied by a mystical faith in the workings of Providence. As Churchill's life unfolded, Providence seemed to take a particular interest in his survival, an interest which Churchill was not embarrassed to record. After India, he saw action in the Sudan and then was famously captured by and escaped from British forces in South Africa. He wrote of those times, quote, "I did not hesitate to ask for special protection when about to come under the fire of the enemy, nor to feel sincerely grateful when I came home safely for a cup of tea." Once, when Churchill was on active duty at the front during the First World War, his dugout was destroyed by a German shell moments after he had left it, decapitating another soldier. Churchill observed that he, quote, "felt a strong sensation that a hand had been stretched out to move me in the nick of time from a fatal spot." 15 years later, Churchill was severely injured in a car accident on New York's Fifth Avenue and asked, quote, "I do not understand why I was not broken like an eggshell or squashed like a gooseberry." Winston Churchill was, of course, a practicing and practical politician for some 60 years of his life, so he was aware that trumpeting his religious views, or lack thereof, might impair his career. Atheists or even agnostics did not make good candidates, especially for the Conservative Party, which had taken Churchill back into its ranks in 1924. And despite his own shallow faith, Churchill recognized the value of invoking God and religion and harnessing them to politics through his own writing and speaking. In January 1920, defending British efforts to topple the new Bolshevik regime in Russia, he claimed, quote, "We defend freedom of conscience and religious equality. They seek to exterminate every form of religious belief that has given comfort and inspiration to the soul of man." Most notably, in his opposition to Nazi Germany from 1933 on, Churchill included its suppression of freedom of religion and suppression of the Jews as one of his complaints. A few months before Adolf Hitler's accession to power, Churchill met Hitler's press secretary, a man named Ernst Hamstengel, in Munich and asked, "Why is your boss so violent about the Jews? What is the sense of being against a man simply because of his birth?" And during the Second World War, Winston Churchill's use of religious and especially Christian metaphors was pronounced, as Britain engaged in a Manichaean struggle with a German dictator who was as close to an antichrist as could be imagined. He drew on religious vernacular and imagery despite his own lack of faith. Words like salvation, sacrifice, faith, and most notably, the struggle to preserve what he called Christian civilization regularly infused his language. Combining these with Churchill's belief in destiny, providence, and fate produced some of the most powerful and compelling rhetoric of the 20th century. And Churchill took advantage of religious pageantry when the opportunity arose, most notably in August 1941, when he personally supervised the Sunday worship service on board the British battleship the Prince of Wales, which had brought him to the coast of Newfoundland for the Atlantic Charter Conference with Franklin Roosevelt. American support in those difficult times was crucial to Britain's survival, and Churchill searched for anything that would emphasize a common Anglo-American moral and spiritual heritage. The result was a Sunday service that included Onward Christian Soldiers and one of Churchill's favorites, O God, Our Help in Ages Past. Churchill sang the words by heart, and he was seen to weep as the music played on. But there were still some skeptics about all of this. Churchill's doctor, Lord Moran, complained, quote, "King and country, in that order, that's the only religion that Winston has." Churchill's selection of personal friends leaned to unspiritual characters, including what his somewhat more religious wife Clementine called the terrible bees. They were Brendan Bracken, Lord Beaverbrook, and Churchill's closest friend, Lord Birkenhead. She had varying degrees of dislike for each of these men, and certainly none of them were recognized as people of any particular faith or even morality. Churchill justified his own lack of observance and his very spotty church attendance by saying, quote, "I am not a pillar of the church, but a buttress. I support it from the outside." Ceremonial occasions, family christenings, weddings, and funerals were about the only thing that drew him past those buttresses and into the pillars. But when he did attend, Churchill, not surprisingly, favored traditional liturgy as would befit an aristocratic Tory and a lover of the English language. He once said, quote, "As for the revised version of the Bible and the alterations in the prayer book, they are just grievous." Churchill often thought about death and the possibility of heaven or some afterlife. He was not convinced, once describing death as, quote, "black velvet, eternal sleep." That held no terrors for him, and his advice was, quote, "Let us accept the natural order in which we move." A return to earth did not appeal to him, as he once commented, quote, "Life is a whole, and good and ill must be accepted together. The journey has been enjoyable and well worth making once." His attitudes to religion were sometimes irreverent or even flippant. During the Second World War, his close friend, the devout South African Prime Minister Jan Christian Smuts, complained that Churchill never appealed to what's much called religious motives. Churchill's comeback, referring to his power as head of the government to make ecclesiastical appointments, was, quote, "I have made more bishops than St. Augustine." While that wasn't technically correct, Churchill did appoint 2 archbishops of Canterbury within just a few years during the war. When one of them, an ascetic man named William Temple, died at age 63 after only 2 years in office, Churchill took humorous note of the fact that he was already 7 years older than that, and despite a steady diet of alcohol, cigars, and fattening food, was still going strong. At other times, Churchill found politics clashed with religion. He was not fond of a man named George Bell, the Bishop of Chichester. Bell criticized British bombing of German cities, supported trade unions, and perhaps most annoyingly of all, invited Mahatma Gandhi, the leader of the Indian independence movement that Churchill opposed, to speak at his cathedral. Churchill made sure that Bell was never promoted to archbishop. Perhaps you might be wondering about what Churchill thought of other faiths he encountered in his long life. Judaism and Islam, the other great monotheistic religions, as well as the Hindus he observed in India. To begin with the Jews, at the time of Churchill's birth in 1874, the Jewish community in Britain had a long history, but was modest in size, and anti-Semitism was still widespread. It was only in 1858, just 16 years before Churchill's birth, that the first Jew was able to take a seat in the House of Commons. Fittingly, it was Lionel de Rothschild. He was a son of Europe's most powerful and mythical Jewish family. Instead of taking the traditional oath, quote, "on a true faith of a Christian," Rothschild covered his head and spoke the words, "So help me, Jehovah." Churchill's father, Lord Randolph, was immune to the prevailing negative attitude to the Jews in aristocratic societies. He numbered several Jews among his closest friends, although they were, of course, from some of the wealthiest and most aristocratic members of that community. He was actually criticized by his Gentile peers and family for that friendship. His son Winston came into contact with these men at an early age, and after Lord Randolph died, when Winston was only 20, these Jews served as mentors and financial advisors to him. Both Lord Randolph the father and Winston the son can be considered early Philo-Semites. And for a few years early in his career, at the beginning of the new century, Winston Churchill represented a constituency in Manchester, a third of whose electorate was Jewish. That solidified his relationship, especially when he began a lifelong friendship with a local chemist in Manchester who was part of a movement advocating a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine, which was then part of the Ottoman Empire. That movement, which the British government recognized in the Balfour Declaration in 1917, was called Zionism, and the brilliant chemist was Chaim Weizmann. 43 years after he first met Winston Churchill, Chaim Weizmann became the president of the new state of Israel. Winston Churchill became embroiled in the politics of the Middle East when, as colonial secretary after the First World War, he helped to draw the boundaries of 2 new nations, Iraq and Jordan, and of the British Mandate of Palestine. As he became more familiar with the Jews and their history, his admiration for them grew. While he recognized, quote, "some people like Jews and some do not," he noted that, quote, "no thoughtful man can deny the fact that they are beyond question the most formidable and remarkable race that has ever appeared in the world." By the way, Churchill did not use race in a biological sense, but as a synonym for an ethnic or national group. He referred to the English people in the same way. Churchill's affection for the Jews was reciprocated as they recognized his continuing support for their interests in Palestine. Churchill said that the establishment in Palestine of a Jewish home would, quote, be a tremendous event in the history of the world. And most importantly, he became associated in Jewish minds with opposition to Nazi Germany and the genocidal plans of Adolf Hitler. While Churchill saw the Jews as a distinct ethnic group, a race in his words, he also thought about and respected Judaism as a great religion. Churchill's official biographer, the late Sir Martin Gilbert, who was himself Jewish, noted, quote, Churchill, like many of his contemporaries, was deeply versed in the Bible, but unlike many of them, biblical stories were not something he just vaguely remembered. They were something he dramatized. Churchill's interest in the scriptures and in the dramatic characters they portrayed was apparent in a 1931 magazine article he wrote entitled Moses, the Leader of a People. It was part of a series called Great Bible Stories Retold by the World's Best Writers, and in truth, Churchill wrote it in part because he needed the money. But despite that motivation, this article is interesting nonetheless. As Martin Gilbert noted, quote, Churchill took issue with people who said that Moses was only an allegorical figure. Churchill Gilbert said, no, Moses' identity and leadership were a genuine historical event. And Martin Gilbert added, quote, what excited Winston Churchill about the Moses story was on the one hand the Jewish destiny, God's promise to the Jews, and on the other hand, Jewish ethics. In Churchill's language, he said, the closing words of Deuteronomy are an apt expression of the esteem in which a great leader and liberator of the Hebrew people was held by generations that succeeded him. And even at a time when his own political future was highly uncertain, Churchill undoubtedly identified with great figures in ancient times, saying this, Moses was the greatest of all prophets who spoke in person to the God of Israel. He was the national hero who led the chosen people out of the land of bondage through the perils of the wilderness and brought them to the very threshold of the promised land. That is surely prophetic of Winston Churchill's role in the great world crisis of 1940. Churchill summarized his view of the Jewish religion this way, quote, we owe to the Jews a system of ethics, incomparably the most precious possession of mankind, worth the fruits of all other wisdom and learning put together. On that system, and by that faith, there has been built out of the wreck of the Roman Empire the whole of our existing civilization. Churchill's opinions about Islam are also of interest, especially today when the relationship between the Muslim world and the West is mired in controversy. As often happens with Churchill, his words have been drawn into that discussion. If you do a Google search on Churchill and Islam, you will quickly come up with the following quotation. It goes, how dreadful are the curses which Mohammedanism lays on its votaries. Besides the fanatical frenzy, there is this fearful fatalistic apathy wherever the followers of the prophet rule or live. And the quote continues, individual Muslims may display splendid qualities, but the influence of the religion paralyzes the social development of those who follow it. No stronger retrograde force exists in the world. And the quotation concludes, Mohammedanism is a militant and proselytizing faith. Were it not that Christianity is sheltered in the strong arms of science, the civilization of Europe might fall. Those are pretty strong words, so it's not surprising today that critics of Islam, and in fact outright Islamophobes, frequently repeat it. But I would ask you, where does it come from, and is it an accurate representation of Churchill's long-term views? The quote is from Winston Churchill's second book, a 2-volume tome entitled The River Wars, published in 1899. It is a very vivid account of the war which Britain waged against the Mahdi rebellion in the Sudan, which had begun the previous decade. During this war, Churchill participated in one of the last cavalry charges in the history of the British Empire at the Battle of Omdurman in 1898. The tribal forces that the British defeated during that war were known as dervishes, and they were the Taliban or ISIS of their day, determined to purify their faith and expel foreign influences. They hardly represented the much larger mass of Muslims in other parts of the British Empire, including millions living peacefully under British rule in countries such as Egypt and India. The relatively inexperienced 25-year-old Winston Churchill wrote harshly of the fundamentalism and fanaticism of the dervishes, but his condemnation is best seen as the product of a specific time and place rather than of a faith as a whole. Indeed, at the time, Churchill, as I've noted, was dismissive of all organized religion, Christianity included. In future years, Churchill's view of Islam evolved, and he became more admiring, although his knowledge of it was largely predicated on Victorian notions. Churchill's evolving views were highlighted in his friendship with Arabists such as Wilfrid Blunt, the poet and political radical, and especially his friendship with a close associate, a British Army officer, Colonel T.E. Lawrence. Of course, we know him better today thanks to a brilliant movie as Lawrence of Arabia. Churchill's opinions of Muslims were also influenced by their large presence in India, which in the imperial age included both India, Pakistan, and what is now Bangladesh. Muslims in disproportionate numbers made up the backbone of the Indian Army, which was led by British officers, but otherwise formed the local population. The Indian Army was critical in preserving the jewel in the crown, which was the preservation of which was one of Winston Churchill's lifelong goals. Although Winston Churchill cannot be said to have ever acquired a truly deep understanding of Islam, he valued these modern-day Muslim warriors. He thought them to be a martial race and an important counterbalance to the more numerous Hindus of whom Churchill was much less fond. The Hindus, he felt, failed to appreciate the benefits of British rule. The agitation for independence of the Hindu-dominated Indian National Congress and its leader Mahatma Gandhi vexed Churchill for over 3 decades. In his frustration, he let loose some classic insults, saying at one point, "The Indians are a beastly people with a beastly religion." In 1942, in the middle of the Second World War, Churchill predicted the following to Ivan Maisky, the Russian ambassador in London, saying that should the British be forced to leave India, quote, "eventually the Muslims will become master because they are warriors, while the Hindus are windbags. Of course, when it comes to fine speeches, skillfully balanced resolutions, and legalistic castles in the sky, the Hindus are then real experts." And Churchill continued, "When it comes to business, when something must be done quickly, here the Hindus take a pass and immediately reveal their flabbiness." Churchill's criticism of the caste system, the Brahmin treatment of the untouchables, and the persistence of child marriage, sati, and other practices was well-founded. But even Churchill's staunchest admirers recognized that his views on India and Hinduism were anachronistic and intolerant, even in his day. It was only in the 1950s, after the partition of the subcontinent and Indian independence, that Churchill mellowed. He developed a respectful relationship with India's first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, although that was admittedly fostered by the fact that Nehru was, like Churchill, a graduate of Harrow. So I would say the next time someone lectures you about Winston Churchill's views about Islam, you can tell them they only know part of the story. So let's go back to Churchill and Christianity. Churchill's lack of Christian faith did not diminish his regard for Jesus as a person who he held in high regard. One of his associates, Desmond Morton, said that while Churchill, quote, did not believe that Christ was God, he recognized him as the finest character who would ever lived. In 1952, during Churchill's second term as Prime Minister, his devoted private secretary, Jock Colville, recorded in his diary the following conversation as Churchill walked in the garden of his private country residence, Chequers, along with Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery. Colville reported this: "How did Churchill define a great man?" Montgomery asked. "Was Hitler great?" "No," answered Churchill, "he made too many mistakes." Then the two leaders discussed whether great religious leaders were the truly great men. Churchill said, quote, "Their greatness was indisputable, but it was of a different kind." He continued, "Christ's story was unequaled, and his death to save sinners unsurpassed." And then Churchill added, "Moreover, the Sermon on the Mount was the last word in ethics." To another private secretary, Sir Anthony Montague Brown, Churchill on several occasions said, quote, "I believe that man is an immortal spirit." Churchill referred to God as the old man, which ironically was the same name applied to him by his younger contemporaries in his 9th decade of life in the 1950s and 1960s. A bit earlier, on his 75th birthday in 1949, Churchill quipped, quote, "I am ready to meet my Maker. Whether my Maker is prepared for the great ordeal of meeting me is another matter." That meeting was not to occur for another 16 years, and Winston Churchill wanted a grand send-off. His state funeral at St. Paul's Cathedral in January 1965 was perhaps the greatest in British history and attracted a worldwide audience. Leaders of 110 nations attended. Winston Churchill was particularly fond of music and chose the Battle Hymn of the Republic, a tribute, he said, to his American mother, "Fight the good fight, and once again, O God, our help in ages past," to be part of the service. So we don't know how Winston Churchill's meeting with the old man went, if it in fact did occur. Churchill expressed some anxiety about heaven, fearing it might be an egalitarian place like the new British welfare state created by the Labour Party, and, quote, "therefore, no place for me." But he was intrigued by the possibility of meeting great men of the past, such as Julius Caesar and Napoleon. Winston Churchill certainly thought that history would rank him as their equal. There were other aspects of heaven that appealed to Churchill more. He was a devoted and talented painter for 40 years in his life. He always longed to spend more time doing it, so he commented, quote, "When I get to heaven, I mean to spend a considerable portion of my first million years in painting so I can get to the bottom of the subject." In his book from 1930, My Early Life, Churchill made the following insightful observation on the difficulty felt by some people in reconciling faith and reason. He said, quote, "Why do they want to reconcile them? If you are the recipient of a message which cheers your heart and fortifies your soul, which promises you reunion with those you have loved, why should you worry about the shape of the envelope it comes in and whether the date on it is right or wrong?" And Churchill continued, quote, "I adopted quite early in life a system of believing whatever I wanted to believe, while at the same time leaving reason to pursue unfettered paths wherever she was capable of treading." The distinguished British historian Andrew Roberts who last year wrote what is absolutely the best single-volume biography of Churchill, made the following observation, quote, "Winston Churchill's message is as wise as it is tolerant and totally consistent with his religion of healthy-mindedness." And Andrew continues, "Winston Churchill may not have believed that he had an immortal soul, but if he did, it was undoubtedly a great one." So let me sum up this subject of Churchill, God, religion, and destiny this way. Winston Churchill believed that Christianity was important to Western civilization. He was convinced that the ethics informed by it were vital for the sanctification of democracy. Later in life, he meditated, quote, "It is bad for a nation when it is without faith." I would characterize Churchill, in the words of Anthony Montague Brown, as an optimistic agnostic. He was not an atheist, but perhaps you could call him a deist. If so, that would place him in the company of another great man from our history, Thomas Jefferson. Winston Churchill did not necessarily believe in God, but to the extent he did, he was certain that God believed in him. If that was indeed the case, the world of Winston Churchill's day, as well as our own, owes both a debt to that deity for creating him, and then to Winston Spencer Churchill himself, who saved both faith and freedom during one of history's darkest hours. Thank you. This talk tonight was an example of a Jewish person telling a Christian audience about a man who might or might not have been. Very good. So I'm happy to answer any questions any of you guys have, or were there things about that you found novel or interesting? And, was Churchill? I'll ask Andrew. Let's do a show of hands. Was Churchill a Christian or not a Christian? Right. It's hard to get votes here. We don't know. I guess it is the answer. Well, thank you so much for being here. I actually have a PowerPoint presentation that goes along with this talk, so you want to see pictures of some of these people, just email me a note, or I'll give you my card and you're welcome to it. Yes, sir.
So I have a question. I'm relatively young, although not super young, but my primary introduction to Winston Churchill has been through dramatic performances, like John Lithgow's in The Crown. Yep. There have been several in recent years. Have there been any that have struck a chord with you that you found to be especially noteworthy?
I actually do a talk called Churchill at the Movies, which is about all the films that he's been portrayed in, and also his own interest in film, which was significant. He was a friend of Laurence Olivier, the producer Alexander Korda, actually of Charlie Chaplin, believe it or not, and he recognized film as an important vehicle of propaganda. The issue with Churchill films or stage plays or novels is you have to distinguish between the performance, which is one thing, and the script. Certainly, Darkest Hour, which came out about 2 years ago, won an Academy Award for Gary Oldman, is one of the best presentations of Churchill. If you know what Gary Oldman looks like, there's no way he could be turned into Winston Churchill. And supposedly it took 3 to 4 hours every morning of makeup and prosthetics to turn him into Churchill, followed by 8 or 10 hours a day of shooting. So it was a very physically demanding role. That film won 2 Oscars, one for Best Actor, which he well deserved, and one for Best Makeup, which was equally deserved. The classic portrayal of Churchill was by a British actor, Robert Hardy, just passed away about 2 years ago, who was in a British TV series called The Wilderness Years. And he was the actor who Mary Soames, Churchill's last surviving child, felt best expressed the sense of her father. There's sometimes terrible Churchill films with good actors. There was one 2 years ago called Churchill with Brian Cox, and the portrayal was effective, but the script was garbage. It was a very fictionalized story that attempted to make the case that Churchill tried to sabotage the D-Day landings, which was completely untrue. I reviewed it in The Spectator, and I borrowed a phrase from Andrew Roberts, who hated it, who said, "This film was so bad that Joseph Goebbels would have been proud of it." That was a mean thing to say, I admit. So certainly, Darkest Hour is a film that is worth seeing once and probably again. I'm a little too picky about Churchill films, so I look at little details of history. The biggest fault, I think, of that film was the scene, you remember, when he goes down into the London Underground and seeks advice of the common people and comes back up and is determined now to resist Hitler and so on. That's a nice populist gloss. Churchill was actually only on the London Underground once in his life, 20 years before, and suppose he got lost and his wife had to come and find him. He was like Charlie on the MTA in that old song, going round and round and round. In reality, I think Churchill recognized that he had to continue to lead Britain in opposition to Germany, and that any kind of negotiations would be a slippery slope from which Britain would not recover. But he did have to maneuver around Lord Halifax in the cabinet, and so there's a kernel of truth to that. But the screenwriters, creating this popular image is not necessarily in accordance with history. But it made for a great scene and made the film popular. That film grossed over $150 million around the world, which for a serious film for an adult audience is a lot of money. So we were very happy that it did as well as it did, and we'd love for Gary Oldman to do Churchill again. We'll see if he does. Yes, sir.
Was Churchill dismayed at the collapse of the British Empire, which largely happened still in his life?
Yes, that was a great lament of his. Churchill's last 10 years from 1955, when he retired as Prime Minister at age 80, when he died in 1965 at 90, are sort of a poignant period. It was marked by his own physical decline. He never wanted to retire. He envied Franklin Roosevelt. I think he said at one point this was a glorious death to die in the harness of battle. And I think Churchill recognized that what he thought of the world, even as late as 1945, wasn't the world 20 years later. He said to, I think it was Anthony Montague Brown, late in his life, when he was a few years before his death, I have worked long and hard to achieve so much, but in the end to achieve nothing. And he saw a lot of the things which were the foundation of his worldview. Britain as a great world power militarily, politically, economically, as a equal ally of the United States, as the head of a great world empire. He could see by the early 1960s that these things had disintegrated. What he would say today, when they've disintegrated even more, is another story. So I think he recognized that his world, he was born and grew up in the Victorian era, and the world of his post-prime ministership the last 10 years was so totally different. It was even more different today. So there's sort of a sadness. The physical decline is part of that. There is sort of a sadness and poignancy to his last years. Perhaps the lesson is, if you're a great man, you should drop dead at the height of your importance and power. It's hard not to be. And Churchill always wanted to be in the center of the action. So as the long sunset of his last 10 years was a painful thing for him and his family, even while he was the greatest and most revered man in the world. So I think that's my sense of it. Yes, sir.
The evangelist Billy Graham came to Britain, I believe, in the 1950s.
I think I remember that. Wasn't that seen in the Crown TV show? I think.
Yeah, I've seen
Yeah.
that. But I know that one of the things that he does while he's there is he has this private meeting with Winston Churchill.
Yeah.
There's different stories of what went on in the conversation. I was just curious if you read about that.
Yeah, I remember reading about that, but I honestly don't remember the details. Was that when he was still Prime Minister, or was after?
Yeah, it was during his second premiership.
My recollection is I remember reading about that, and I guess I'll come back with some thoughts, and I'll go look it up. My sense of it is that this kind of American, loud evangelism wasn't something that Churchill necessarily recognized. It was a long way from the orderly worship of the Church of England. But I will do my homework on that, and we'll come back with with a better answer. Yeah. Ironically, today, or perhaps not ironically, evangelical Christians are probably among the greatest fans of Winston Churchill, for various reasons. Any more questions? Thank you all. I enjoyed being here.
Thank you.